Hey guys, let's continue our discussion here in literature. You should have read The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. And so let's discuss a couple of things about that you'll want to know for the test. All right, I told you to look for a couple of things to decide what the tone was. Is it critical, neutral, or sympathetic? And then if you could answer the question, how did General Zaroff justify his hunting game? So a couple of things I want to point out. One thing I wanted to point out was the irony of one of the statements that General Zaroff said on page 624 at the end there, the very last sentence. He says, "This is a most restful spot." What is the irony between him saying that and the very last sentence, right at the end of the story? Remember the last sentence? He had never slept in a better bed, Rainsford decided. So kind of ironic that Zaroff would say that earlier on in the story. And then answering the question, how did General Zaroff justify his hunting game? Well, the answer to that is on page 626 in the second column. The general filled both glasses and said, "God makes some men poets, some he makes kings, some beggars. Me, he made a hunter." He justifies his hunting because he says that's what God made him. God made him to be a great hunter, and that's how he justifies his hunting game and having to resort to hunting humans, right? Another thing that I wanted to point out was on page 627 when he's explaining more about his hunting. You'll see what his values are. He says, "And hunting, remember, had been my life. I have heard that in America, businessmen often go to pieces when they give up the business that has been their life." So he's justifying it like his values are like those of the American businessmen who supposedly, climb the ladder. And when they give up their business and they stop their business, they just kind of go to pieces. So he's like, if I were to give up hunting, then that would happen to me and I would just go to pieces. Well, at the end, by the time we got to the end of the story, right, and you see what happened at the end, notice that Richard Connell doesn't specifically tell you exactly what happened, but he says, right, it ends with them both in the bedroom and he says, "On guard, Rainsford," right? And then we're not told about the conflict, but we do kind of get to figure it out, don't we? By the very last sentence, he had never slept in a better bed, Rainsford decided. So that implies that there was a fight, right? And that Rainsford won the battle there. So what would you say the tone is? Critical, neutral, or sympathetic toward the main character? If you said sympathetic, you are correct, right? As you're reading it, you feel for Rainsford, right? Don't you? You want him to win and you want him to do well, right? And so you have that sympathetic feeling toward the main character there in the story, right? Okay. Let's go to James Thurber, the one we are going to discuss today. James Thurber. He was partially blind. You see him wearing those glasses there. He was partially blind from a childhood accident, and he began writing seriously while he was in college at Ohio State. He did not actually end up graduating from college, though. But after spending some time in college, he became a newspaper reporter for a while, and then he just became a freelance writer. And in 1927, his career kind of took off. He became successful when he joined the staff of the New Yorker, which was one of the most prestigious magazines in our nation at the time. His first book appeared 2 years later, and then that was followed by a book of cartoons. And you see him kind of drawing some cartoons there in that picture down at the bottom. So he liked to draw cartoons as well. He did eventually end up losing his eyesight completely. And then, even after losing his sight, he continued writing. And he even wrote more books in the last 10 years of his life than he did in any other decade. He ended up dying in 1961. He had emergency surgery for a blood clot on his brain and actually ended up dying. He was a humorist. His cartoons and his fiction are both meant to cause laughter, but his laughter is not always gentle, right? We're in this pessimistic era, so that pessimism and that bitterness, that cynicism comes across. Sometimes his humor is, or his stories are bitter and critical of mankind, kind of like Ambrose Bierce and Samuel Clemens. And His character, um, in his typical short story, his characters are usually baffled or terrified by life. His most famous story, you might have heard of it, or they turned it into a movie. Maybe you've seen the movie, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, about this man who is kind of he has this domineering wife, and he's kind of a timid man, and so he retreats into this imaginative world where he imagines himself in all of these different situations, and that's kind of how he escapes to make his real life seem more tolerable. But that's probably the story that he's the most famous for, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. But in this story, The Catbird Seat, as you read it, you're going to feel for the main character, Mr. Martin, but what he's planning to do, he's planning a murder. And he's this very timid, quiet man who just faithfully goes about his work, never smokes, never drinks, but yet he's planning this murder. Okay. And so, but what he actually ends up accomplishing, um, the way Thurber presents it, it's never condemned by him. They're presented as a legitimate way to take care of the problem. So you see, there's kind of a lack of a moral foundation in his story. Even though it's humorous, we do have that touch of pessimism in the story. With Mr. Martin is this picture of this like frustrated little man in the story. The chief device that he uses is irony. We have verbal irony and dramatic irony throughout this story. So you're going to read The Catbird Seat. Read that for tomorrow. There are some things that I want you to look for because you'll need to know these for the test. So some things you want to look at. First of all, is to notice his use of the anti-hero. You do need to know what an anti-hero is, right? An anti-hero is the opposite of your traditional hero, but yet it's the hero of the story. Okay, so you'll notice Mr. Martin, he's weak, he's bumbling, thoughtless, dishonest, right? This type of hero kind of reflects this age of pessimism and their disbelief in virtue and heroic action. So the anti-hero kind of reflects that belief of this era. So notice how he uses the anti-hero. I want you to figure out what is the primary conflict in the story, what is the secondary conflict in the story, and then what is the tone of the story? Would you say that the tone of the story is critical, neutral, or sympathetic? By the end of the story, how are you feeling toward the main character? All right. So read the story, see if you can find the answers to those questions, and then we will discuss this story tomorrow and go on to the next person.